Good evening. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar. I am Marika Oglesby, Director of the Women's Leadership Institute of Baltimore at Notre Dame of Maryland University, also known as WLIB. WLIB was reignited in 2018 to recognize and celebrate the accomplishments of outstanding women in the Baltimore region and beyond through curated experiences for leadership and personal development. Through the convening of discussions on gender equity, WLIB offers programming pertinent to the advancement of women to inspire action and connection. The Charles J. Busta Forum that you joined us for today is designed to showcase the thoughts and experiences of business leaders, especially women leaders, in order to encourage creativity and personal growth. Tonight, we have an excellent program planned for you. Now, I would like to introduce Dr. Mary Lou Yam, the 14th president of Notre Dame of Maryland University.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Marika. Thanks to all the faculty, students, staff, and distinguished guests. Welcome to the 19th Annual Charles J. Busta III Business Forum. This year, we are thrilled to present our special invited guests. Sherry Hinish, IBM Global Executive Partner of Sustainability and Circularity, in conversation with Susan Applin, co-CEO of the World Trade Center Institute, on the topic of diversity in supply chain. As many of you know, Notre Dame has an accredited business and economics department offering 3 undergraduate degree programs in business, international business, and marketing and communications in partnership with our communications art department, and minors in business, economics, and entrepreneurship. We also offer graduate level degree and certificate programs in risk management, leadership and management, philanthropy, nonprofit management, as well as a certificate in enrollment management. For the Busta Forum, NDMU seeks inspirational professionals of integrity who have made a real difference, overcome significant obstacles, or delivered dramatic, unexpected successes. And that's why this event is so special to our community, for CB's dedication to and focus on our students. We especially seek women in their fields who meet these criteria in order to provide Notre Dame students with strong role models who can set a high standard for achievement. Our speakers exhibit leadership, creativity, innovation, a competitive spirit, and demonstrate the integration of business with their personal lives. Charles Busta was a remarkable friend to Notre Dame, a board member, a community leader, a mentor. He was a proponent for the advancement of women. The Busta Forum was established in his memory as a way to highlight women leaders in the business field. Now, I would like to take a moment to recognize the Busta Forum Steering Committee, many of whom are joining our Zoom program this evening, including Bonnie Busta, Carly Busta, Carol Bodie, Don Pettit, Debbie Calhoun, and Joan Davidson. Although Joan and Debbie will be transitioning off the committee, we are grateful for their many years of dedicated volunteer service. Thank you all on the committee for your commitment to this program, for bringing notable leaders to our campus, and for driving home the importance of raising business leaders. And now, on behalf of the Notre Dame community, I'm very proud and pleased to introduce Caroline Carly Busta, CB's daughter, who will give remarks about his wonderful legacy and introduce our panelists. Thank you.
Okay, is it? Okay, good. Dr. Yam, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction and those words about my father. And thank you, Marika, and to the entire Notre Dame team for producing and hosting this event. And of course, also to the steering committee for carrying this forward for so many years. As Dr. Yam said, I am the daughter of Charles and Bonnie Busta, and I have the great pleasure this evening of introducing you to our guest, Susan Applin and Sherry Hamish, two distinguished professionals in the supply chain and logistics sector. If you're thinking supply chains, just wait. Before we go there, however, I would like to share with you a few words about my dad, C.B. Busta, as it's through this forum and ultimately through you that his spirit lives on. In June of 1999, my father died suddenly. He had a cerebral brain hemorrhage and he was 51. This series was established by my mother and his friends in his name in partnership with Notre Dame. At the time of his death, my father was an executive vice president and general manager of Revlon. He spent most of his career, however, working to build the CoverGirl brand, specifically bringing in the likes of Christy Brinkley and Nikki Taylor and Tyra Banks, and promoting an idea of feminine beauty that's, well, to borrow the CoverGirl tagline, clean, fresh, and natural. Given this, you might be surprised to know that my father got his start working in the Cleveland steel mills, and that he was the first person in his family to go to college. Like many of you tuning in this evening, my father had a vision of himself that was the best version of himself, and he fully went for that dream. Key to his success, in addition to my mother, of course, Bonnie Busta, who is also joining us virtually somewhere in this Zoom universe, were creativity, integrity, and charisma. We are incredibly lucky to be joined tonight by two women who absolutely share the same kind of life spirit. Okay, so IBM Global Executive Partner of Sustainability and Circularity Lead, Sherry Hamish, who, if you're on Twitter, you may also know as the Supply Chain Queen. I highly recommend you follow her immediately because you can browse through lots of cool links that she's already posted and posts every single day. And also by the co-CEO of the World Trade Center Institute in Baltimore, Susan Applin. And you can also follow the World Trade Center Institute. Hopefully that will also be linked because they post lots of really useful information, especially for businesses local to the Chesapeake region. Susan is an outspoken corporate leader who, before joining the World Trade Center Institute in her current capacity, held executive roles in several large global brands, including Staples and Williams-Sonoma. She also co-founded the trailblazing sustainable home decor and furnishings brand, Bambeco. She is a former professional tennis player. I hope it's okay to say that. I noticed that in your bio. I thought that was so cool. And as we will hear, is driven by purpose, advocating for the environment, diversity and inclusion, the advancement of women, and human rights. She also served as part of the United States Department of Treasury CEO Roundtable Commission during the Obama administration. So quite a few qualifications there. Like Susan, Sherry is also devoted to using her professional platform for social change. She holds a master's from Harvard in sustainability, and as a high-level advisor supporting IBM's global supply chain transformation teams, she helps the clients, colleagues, and communities she serves to build a more equitable and resilient operation. If you already follow Sherry on Twitter or have just followed now, you know that she is dizzyingly active on the public stage as a business-to-business influencer, shepherding the next generation of entrepreneurs and corporate leaders towards, to borrow Sherry's words, the supply chain revolution. Before handing the stage over to Sherry and Susan, I also wanted to offer a few words of framing. Why are we focusing on supply chains and logistics for this year's forum? And what does diversity have to do with managing the production and circulation of resources? What do the logistics of distributing things have to do with human social change? It may seem like they're not necessarily compatible. Well, because as Sherry and Susan will no doubt make clear, supply chains connect the world. And we've seen this thrown into high relief over the past couple of years with COVID. We know that getting masks was difficult, or vaccines was difficult, or getting workers to staff places was difficult. All these are components of supply chains. And we're seeing now with this tragic war that's happening in Ukraine that I live in Germany and there's not sunflower oil on the shelves. And we know that Baltimore is now a very important node in supplying different kinds of fossil fuels to Europe to try to reorganize the global supply of energy, of fossil fuels. And so that's one big reason, because supply chains are really, really important to the way we understand the world now. Secondly, because of Baltimore's history. There may be historians out here who will correct me, but if memory serves, Fells Point was named such something like 1670. Like, that's crazy. That's 17th century that the Baltimore Harbor was already in use. And it's amazing that several hundred years later, that it's still an incredibly important node on the global stage. So we figured that there were multiple reasons why we should think about what women's roles might be in this and what women are doing in this space in particular. So I guess without further ado at this point, we should just now hand it over to Sherry and Susan. And maybe as a way of starting, could you give us a sense of your personal journeys, which are both really interesting, and perhaps how the Chesapeake region has played into the life choices and career choices you two have made?
Sure. Thank you, Carly. And I just want to say thank you to Notre Dame of Maryland. And I'm thrilled to be here with Sherry as well. I'll jump in and go first and take this one. I like to think about my career in two buckets, the before and after. The before was almost 30 years with big global brands, as Carly mentioned earlier. Living in different parts of the world and different parts of the US. And then I like to think of that second phase as my 3 tours of duty in what I call the entrepreneurial phase of my career. The first 2 were in the fintech world, which brought me to Maryland to begin with. And the last startup was a company that I co-founded. And the Chesapeake Bay had everything to do with the company Bambico and where we went and why we decided to headquarter it in Baltimore. How did Bambico come about? I was standing on a glacier in Alaska, and for the first time in my life in 2005, I was witnessing climate change. And I was completely blown away. It was evident when we hiked, it was evident when we sailed and kayaked, and it was absolutely evident when we had direct conversations with fishermen. All of that led, and it was a journey to create a company that would change and disrupt the home decor space. And that was the origin of Bambico. Bambico in the Chesapeake Bay, it was the perfect place to put it. We had the Port of Baltimore, which we have. It's one of the most important ports that we have in the US. The Chesapeake Bay is leading the world in defining how to clean water and clean the waterways. There's an incredible creative talent here in Baltimore, but there were so many reasons why we decided to put the company here. But environmental alignment, sustainable alignment was a key part of that. And so I like to say that the two came together. It wasn't Chesapeake Bay that really defined my second part of my career, but it certainly gave it a perfect home to flourish.
Wonderful. Thank you, Susan. And thank you everyone for joining. I also have strong ties to Maryland as a Maryland native, so born and raised. I'm also, as Marika highlighted early on, a first generation college student. So neither one of my parents went to college. I'm actually the first woman to go to college, and I'm a graduate of University of Maryland for my bachelor's. I love Maryland. And when you think about just we have 4 seasons here. It's the first thing when I tell people they it's mind blowing that we get to experience nature in all its forms and its breadth of beauty. The other thing that's really cool about growing up in Maryland is the commitment to stewardship. And I think that was eloquently highlighted by Susan. Diversity is essential. It's an essential value that runs deep in a lot of Marylanders, something I'm certainly passionate about. And I think we're going to talk about really cool concepts where cognitive diversity shows up in ethical innovation and some of the work that I lead at IBM Consulting. But for me, just, going down the shore, hun, every, literally like part of the tie to the Bay, into the Atlantic, into coastal communities in general. And you see, a lot of people don't know that the Bay is one of the third largest estuaries in the world. And there's a lot of complexity when you get into multi-stakeholder management and really getting clear on the path forward. That's a path that leaves no one behind. And you have to balance a lot of nuances when you think about something called sustainable development. For me, I did not have an easy journey. I appreciate Carly calling out the Supply Chain Queen brand, which was a nickname. I think of myself as more of a rebel, but supply chain wasn't a first or second career choice for me. It was probably a third or fourth, and it happened. I sort of fell into supply chain because a lot of things didn't really pan out. Which was incredible, because once I found supply chain and all the opportunity around solving complex problems, it completely changed my life. So super excited to join everyone. Maryland is a great state. We have incredible institutions of education, higher education here, and I'm a graduate. All of the things that I've learned at Maryland, both in the University of Maryland system, briefly attended Loyola, and also Bowie State University, one of Maryland's oldest HBCUs. All of that prepared me to graduate top of my class at Harvard University in graduate school. So pleasure to share my story, and hopefully we get the chat on fire soon here. I see everyone's quiet. Please feel free to chat as we unpack this discussion.
Sherry, I would love to jump in here. And you said a couple of things in your opening. You just have a remarkable personal story and an incredible attachment and connection to Maryland. You fell into supply chain, and supply chain is so lucky that you did. As you think about Baltimore and Mid-Atlantic and the role that it plays in North America, what have you seen? What big impacts have you seen over the past years? And how's that changing your career now?
Yeah, that's a great way to open. I think, so for me, one of the things that I'm very passionate about, I actually just came back from an event late February that evangelizes the power of STEM pathways, specifically in HBCUs. I find that we have so much talent in Maryland and so much talent in general in looking at communities who have historically been underrepresented in STEM and supply chain. And when I say STEM, I do mean supply chain. So this could be science, mathematics, really cool, innovative startups. So the entrepreneurial arm is there. Also the arts, when you think about design thinking, experience journeys, leaning into change management, and then lastly, mathematics. And the reason that this is relevant is because sustainability and digital transformation for the first time are inextricably linked to each other. So digital actually makes sustainability possible, and it's a great accelerator. When I look specifically at the talent in Maryland, I think that we have to do better. We have to be intentional, insist on making rooms, encouraging the right talent management strategies to reach back earlier in someone's education journey. I personally have those programs in place through PTech and Open PTech at IBM. So engaging folks in underrepresented communities in 9th grade, and then making sure that they have the right level of engagement and support so they actually make it into IBM and they're engaged and they have an early hire professional program and all of those things that you would say, wow, doesn't that exist? Guess what? A lot of companies do not have that structure and rigor. So folks, early hire professionals and college graduates can feel included and accepted and feel like they're in an equitable workspace. Specifically for Baltimore, I lived in Baltimore City for 13 years. There's so much opportunity in Baltimore. The one thing that really, frankly, it kept me up at night was just how you see the tie between social inequity and, you know, all of the nuances that we know exist in sustainable development, but you see it unfolding, and that we are leaving folks behind. The digital divide is real. Access is the new capital. People used to throw all these phrases around, but what does access mean? Access means that, you know, good education, opportunity, fair living wages, like all of the things that you would think, again, intuitively are there. These require systems changes. So those are just a couple ideas to kick us off, Susan.
We are going to come back to the digital divide. It's an important part of our conversation we're going to have today, and I'm thrilled to have it with you. You were talking about STEM, and STEM, Maryland has more STEM professionals than any other place in the world, yet only 9% are minority. And you're absolutely right. We really need to do better on this front. We're talking about local. Now I would love to shift global for a minute and talk to you about current events. There's a war happening, Russia's war in Ukraine, and it's disrupting supply chain today. And it's also having an impact right here in Maryland. As you think about this fallout and what's happening with this war, as well as the shift in trading blocks prior to the war, what are you seeing in terms of the impacts to the Baltimore port and impacts to Maryland from a supply chain perspective?
Sure. So this is a big question. We could probably spend the next 30 minutes talking about this. I want to try and be mindful that people watching may not have a really robust supply chain education. So supply chains generally, they like stability. They like reliable demand signals. We've put strategy, sourcing strategy, network strategy, execution strategy, so downstream logistics in place. So in theory, everything flows, everything happens naturally, and you get your product, or Baltimore receives its product and its shipments on time and in full. The problem with this is that if we go up 10,000 feet, we have relied on globalization, so longer supply chains, to iterate to something called lowest cost. We don't understand what that cost is anymore when we think about things like climate change. And what is the cost of carbon emissions? What is the social cost of pollution in the communities that we all know and love and where we live, in the communities that Susan and I serve in our everyday work life? So all of these costs have a price. And when you also think about long supply chains and sourcing globally, instead of thinking about maybe going local and having a shorter supply chain that's happier, that doesn't have the same types of risk. And these risks are very complicated, because the further your supply chain sources and the further that chain extends, you also build in other things: lead time, longer lead times, demand volatility and variation, and geopolitical risk, things that are unstable. So you don't have the same amount of autonomy and control in your supply chain, versus if you were to maybe go local and think about a hybrid sourcing strategy. The huge opportunity that we have right now is that we see that these types of demand and supply shocks, with COVID, with China, with the war right now that we're living through, with climate change, with social inequity and erratic weather events, all of these things are not as unusual anymore as they used to be. This is a paradigm shift or a sea-level change in the way that we think about designing supply chains, designing for success, and designing out risk and complexity. So for me, one of the things that I encourage folks to do is really rethink a lot of that. What you'll find is we're still operating from a 1984 playbook. So a lot of the same motions that we have, and a lot of the same motions that affect us here in Maryland and in the Baltimore port, This is because no one's ever stepped back and said, I wonder if we could do this a better way. I wonder if there was a better way. And it's literally being intentional and leading into another muscle, being purpose-driven, Susan. And I know that you're very passionate about this. These are the types of things that are at our feet and that we're responsible for leading right now, including everyone watching. Like, this is your moment. We as leaders have to step up and create room for new ideas and fresh ideas and redesign and rethink supply chain networks.
And when we think about doing that, what do you think the role of women is in stepping up, solving some of these big issues? Now we're on a topic that's near to your heart and near to mine.
Yeah, so it's incredible. You think about a lot of the complexities that we just described. Women need to be in the room. You have to have also diversity. So I talk a lot about cognitive diversity, how you come at a problem from different angles, how you diverge. This is so critical because you want the ideas to really build on all the capabilities. What I often see, and there's two parts to this answer, is that you often have an echo chamber of ideas when you lack diversity in the room. Every system that we have and that we see is perfectly designed to get the results that it's getting. Okay, that's how this works. So you have to make sure that you have the right people in the room and that a space is created where those voices can thrive. This is where representation and inclusion really matters. So not just diversity, but then what's the other side of that? You shouldn't have to scream for your voice to be heard. So that's the other thing. What I often find is even if women or other underrepresented groups are invited to the table, they shouldn't have to bang on the table to be heard. There should be a safe space created with psychological safety where they can openly share their thoughts. So it's not just enough to have that representation, but inclusion in creating an equitable workspace is equally as important.
I could not agree with you more. And, you know, when you think about bringing women to the table, for those of us who may find ourselves at different tables today, there is the save a seat for another woman. So create a space. We want to ask women to walk through the door and create their space. We like to encourage people to sheep-eat. So this is a great idea when you have an idea and it's said in the room and it gets repeated by your male colleague and then it gets traction. Other women in the room, when you hear a woman speak up, sheep-eat, repeat it so that it stays, the credit stays where it deserved. When I think about diversity, though, on a broader level, I think about Verna Myers, and I love her quote, "Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance." And when I think about supply chain, it's time for the women to dance. It's time for us to get in and help solve this. And, you know, I think we bring a lot to the table.
Absolutely. I would like to share, you know, the other thing is you mentioned sheep-eating. I hadn't heard it framed like that, but it's so true. As you go through your career, you certainly see behaviors where when you're in a position to either be a door opener or really influence the right behaviors, you can't take that for granted. I have a very tangible example, a recent example, and just to give everyone a flavor of what my teams look like, I have 85% female gender representation, females on my teams. I have been told I need to hire more men. I put racial equity at the center of my hiring. So I have very, very diverse teams. And very recently, there was a younger female who is brilliant and she's not as outspoken. And we certainly know that introverts sometimes struggle when there are overbearing personalities in the room. And there was an older gentleman who was speaking over her. And I absolutely called it out that he was repeating what she already said. He did not allow her to finish, and that we do not have mansplaining in our meetings. And what was interesting is that he actually had no idea that he was doing it. So in that moment, which was very vulnerable, there was a chance to also be a bridge and explain why that was wrong and why it hurt her feelings, and ask him kindly to not do it again. So it ended up being a real feel-good story. I just want to call out that sometimes people you'll meet in your career and in your career journey, they don't understand that what they're doing maybe hurts you or rubs you the wrong way, or that it's not appropriate. So when you have the opportunity, also take time to pause, lead with empathy, and try and be a bridge in understanding.
That's a great example to share, and sometimes a difficult one. And happy for the outcome. There's a big topic, Sherry, that we know people want to hear us discuss, and that's around data and more about diversity. And it's an area that you've spent a lot of time in. So, as you think about the volatility and the places of stress on the supply chain, and you think about AI and blockchain and all the automation that's happening, what are the biggest benefits you're seeing to business, and then the biggest benefit to the consumer?
So this is a great question. I think I do want to just open with, one of the things that I often say is that our faith is not necessarily in technology, that our faith is anchored in humanity and hiring the right people to build the type of ethical innovation that we need. And this is in data, AI, IoT, 5G, blockchain, edge technology, all of the exponential technology and buzzwords that everyone probably hears. Oh, and quantum. So ethical AI is very important to me. What you find is that everyone has bias, whether we want to admit it or not. And sometimes that can show up in the solutions that you build. And that is why it is so important when we think about diversity and cognitive diversity and having the right people in the room to solve some of these complex challenges, but also make sure that there is a holistic and balanced representation of voices and perspectives in designing the type of ethical innovation that we need. Data is so, so important right now. I talk about this all the time. I just came from the Economist Sustainability Week, and I also represent IBM at COP. Interesting and funny story at COP26. I had a little bit of imposter syndrome when I was there, because you're on the stage with world leaders, and there were moments where I was like, do I deserve to be here? Like, oh my gosh, I read about these people. And then you just pause and listen. And every single person, it's like Greta says, blah, blah, blah. We all know what we need to do. And then here's the $6.9 trillion question. Well, how do we do it? And the world leader, or whoever, the thought leader, says, well, we need data and insights and technology. And well, how do you do it? Well, I'm not a technologist. I don't know. So this is critical, because if visualization, you actually have to be able to see what's happening in order to baseline, benchmark, change behavior. You have to have some sort of framework. Yes, I'm not saying, that data is the end all be all, but it's a natural first step. We still trust in God, but all others must bring data. And this is so important when we start to get into something called ESG performance, which a lot of us have probably heard about. When we get into science-based targets, when we start simulating some of those ceiling emissions and we start measuring for net zero, all of those things require data, and they also require collaboration. So not just within your four walls, but across your supply chain. Up to 90% of scope 3 emissions, which are just someone else's scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, happen in the supply chain. And so to up to 85% of ESG related impacts. So when you say, is data important? 100% it's important, but also the people who are designing the solutions to solve a lot of these complex problems. I mean, this is an emergency. If we don't solve it now, in a few years, and definitely by 10 years. I mean, and we won't be talking about climate risk assessments. We'll be having adaptation conversations. So I hope I answered your question. I rattled on a bit.
No, you did. It is complex, ever changing, and defining the world that we're living in today. I had a similar experience a few years back at the United Nations Climate Week, and up on stage were all the big giants on the forefront of sustainability for their industry sector. And Apple for technology, Lisa Jackson was there on stage. And here is Susan Applin, CEO of a company called Bambico that virtually no one has heard of, representing the home decor space. And absolutely a little bit of imposter syndrome, but it's interesting how everyone is trying to solve this. And Lisa Jackson would lean in and say, our biggest challenge was the last mile. It's the last mile that is breaking our ability to achieve what we want to achieve. And with Bambico, I would say our biggest challenge was the first mile. We had the benefit of building this company from ground up with the framework that we wanted, with the values that we wanted. And it was the first mile, figuring out the first mile, that really was the game changer.
That's such a brilliant point. And so we're going to get into the nitty gritty now. Everyone came to talk supply chain. We're going to talk first mile and last mile. So a really cool example of how this shows up in a sustainable supply chain using innovation. There is a use case that I worked on called Farmer Connect and Thank My Farmer. So you think about sustainable sourcing. So the first mile or the first kilometer, when you think about a supply chain network, a lot of the big brands, the CPG brands, they go to a tier 0 or a tier 1. They don't necessarily go all the way to the field or the farm. And in the Thank My Farmer initiative, we had a wicked problem to solve. And the wicked problem was we wanted consumers to be able to use this and have confidence at the shelf where they can scan a QR code. And what this was a bag of coffee, and they could in their app see the provenance or the journey of that bean all the way upstream to the first mile, as Susan just articulated. So this means you have to have nth tier data and visibility. Really cool thing about Thank My Farmer is for the first time, the consumer could not only see the product's journey, but the consumer could also thank their farmer, meaning they could in-app send a message, thumbs up, give a rating to that source community, and also crowdsource and donate in-app toward a community-based project that was anchored in a sustainable development goal. So this is an example of how you can use technology to give the consumer confidence, to make sure that you have responsible sourcing practices, that there's no child labor, forced labor, casual labor in your supply chain, and connect the first mile and the last mile in one seamless thread.
That was brilliant, Sherry. I think there are many people out here that have not spent a career in supply chain, and I think there were a lot of lessons learned here. There is another topic that people want us to dive into on the supply chain front, and that is, as you think about supply chain executives today or managers in various industries, what agency, what power do they have to pursue intentional supply chain changes, to be a part of the sustainability progress within their organization?
So they have a lot of opportunity and they do have a lot of influence. I will tell you that there was some research published by the Institute for Business Value. So that's IBM's research arm, and they're incredible. I do a lot of work with them. Huge study with Oxford Economics. I believe 2,000 CXOs, a lot of them were supply chain leaders who were interviewed, and they have specifically designated the power of supply chain and also the power of that intersection of digital and sustainable. What was most interesting is they asked executives, what are your top 4 priorities. Well, there were 20 priorities, but we zoomed in and double clicked on the top 4. Sustainability was number 4 in terms of immediate priorities. The next question was, what are your top priorities in the next 2 to 3 years? Sustainability was number 2. Efficient operations was number 1 in both questions. So sustainability is a priority. The other thing that I want to call out is that in that study, there was a double click on how do you feel about sustainability? And this is important because think about how we lead with our values, how we show up in the workplace, like our own values and commitments to stewardship. They're important and they likely show up in our decisions. 85% of CEOs felt a personal responsibility to sustainability. What was unclear is, what is my first next step? Depending on my maturity, depending on my existing ambitions and where I've already started, how do I move it forward? And what are the right technology investments to help me get there? So when you say, what influence do leaders have? I think they have incredible influence. One of the biggest influences is making sure that you have the right people that are leading these, this transformation journey, the right connectors, the right learners. These problems, we need learners, not knowers. And you think about everything that we see unfolding, it's that generation that put us here, not to, be snarky, but it's really true. Like it's an incredibly powerful moment for the students watching to know that you have the power to change this. You have the power to make an impact. So I hope that you walk away, and if nothing else, you say, it's our time, it's our moment, like this is ours.
Take it. At the World Trade Center Institute, we focus a lot on professional development of global leaders, but transformational leadership, and through the lens of leaders every day are forced with making decisions. You can go right or you can go left. And if you're in supply chain or product development or packaging development, you can continue to go left and keep your supply chains the same and keep everything in your predictable mold. You can also look right and make a different set of choices. Maybe improve, the impact on the place where you're producing the product. You could also have a more positive impact on the environment. And you can do all of this with the same margin, the same revenue, the same time frame. And so we really want to encourage people, look right, take a different path. I get asked a lot, about my aha moment and going to be an entrepreneur, but you can be an intrapreneur and pursue your passion right inside the 4 walls of your career in your office today. It's just pursuing your job and your role a little differently.
Absolutely. We see a lot of, we actually have something called an innovation hub. So this is a grassroots movement within IBM that now falls under my organization. And it's just, teams who got together. I hate using the word hack because it's very bro culture, but they do like these hackathons, and they're organizing a call for code now. So open to anyone in the public, where you can come and you can basically code toward very specific use cases. The team has won all types of awards in vertical farming and like social impact initiatives, just incredibly humbled by the, get up and go. And this is all on their own doing. I mean, again, I'm just every day, the young people that we have working here, folks that are watching, people that I meet on social media, this is your moment. It's just been incredible.
What do you think the future holds? If you had a prediction, what does it look like to you?
More policy and regulation, because it's very hard for people to do what they say they do. It's interesting, the SEC ruling, I clenched my hands together and said, thank you, because the United States was lagging, in my opinion, lagging behind EMEA and lagging behind some of the other regions in the world that look at things like carbon tax and extended producer responsibility and the social cost of carbon, and look at material utility and single-use plastics, and how all of those things you produce in one country, a brand has some of those decisions upstream in product design, Susan, like you mentioned, in packaging design, and they choose to say, I'll kick the can. I think that the future will require that we ask more of business, and that it is through the compliance lens, unfortunately, that we will see a lot of movement. It's often the carrot or the stick. And I think depending on the lens that we use and the industry lens, that answer will be very different.
Yeah, I get asked this question a lot too, just, in terms of trade and trading blocks and supply chain. And this continuation of the acceleration of deglobalization and shifting trading blocks is making massive and long-term impacts throughout supply chain worlds today. And I'm intrigued by the possibility of the establishment of what is being called the United Federation of the Americas. And as we look forward, when does North America, the US and Canada, come together with South America, Mexico, and the Arctic to really form what is the United Federation of Americas in terms of trading bloc, in terms of production? We would lead with 1.1 billion people with a very intelligent labor force. Innovation, we would also be leading. We would be on par with China. From a protection perspective, we would have top militaries. We're surrounded by 2 oceans. And from a climate resiliency perspective, it starts to give us continuous growing seasons across this entire area. And so that's one of the I guess, big ideas that is being discussed right now that intrigues me is, do we find ourselves moving to these bigger trading blocks, these bigger alliances, and this idea of United Federation of Americas?
I think that might be part of the solution. I still think that, once we get the cost of adoption down low enough for geolocalism, I think that that hurdle might lessen. When we talk about additive manufacturing or 3D printing, or a lot of the, I'm going to throw a supply chain term out, agglomeration. So this is where you have highly skilled trained workers that are focused or coupled. Think of the automotive industry, for example. So they have skilled trade, and they all sort of feed from the same labor pool. They all have the same, fit for purpose and utility in supply chain manufacturing and production. You can sort of decouple that now. Because we do have technology available. We do have access to training now. And the cost of externalizing environmental social risk, you now have to pay for that. There's now a compliance lens. So going further for lowest cost, once you add on a lot of the carbon taxation, extended producer's responsibility, taxing virgin material use, a lot of packaging tax. I could go on and on and on. Maybe you make a different decision. The other thing is leaning into the communities that you serve and saying, what can we do better in the communities we operate right now, and becoming more of a good steward and corporate citizen, and leveraging your global footprint for impacts. So I think it's probably a little bit of both, but certainly I'm seeing a lot of movement toward sourcing locally, and also really being intentional around supplier diversity, especially in North America.
Well, I know there are a lot of questions, and Marika is here. She's going to join us. So I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you both. Man, talk about all of the question marks going off in my head. This should be a 2-hour discussion in my book. We have had a number of questions pop up, some very big questions and some very granular questions. So I'm going to do my best to kind of put them together so that you can answer them, hopefully in an efficient way. So one of the questions that came up, but it's kind of coupling with another is, there are some kind of challenges with the terms that come along with the supply chain world. And I think some people have some ideas of what supply chain is. And Susan, this kind of also goes back to the question we had about Bambico. And hopefully you can find an example for us of how a product starts and how it ends, and how supply chain is the thing that holds it all together. So I'm going to throw that one out to you.
Excellent. Well, in its most simplistic form, think about a product, an everyday product that you have today. It's got physical form, it's got attributes. All that product is comprised of many different materials. So supply chain today is the process of taking a design and sourcing the materials and getting it manufactured. And it's the movement in between of the materials to the factory for the production, and then the movement out to your door. So if you look at that, or to the warehouse before it gets to your door, but if you look at that whole process end to end, that's the most simplistic way to think about it. At Bambico, supply chain was more complex because, like I said, we started at the first mile. There was rigor around every material type, where it came from, what ingredients were in it, making sure there were no toxic chemicals. Everything had a rating. Everything had to be investigated. We had auditors that were constantly out auditing the process and researching, and testers who would secretly pull products and get them tested to verify that what we were saying was in the product was in the product. So at Bambico, it was very complex, but it is basically getting those materials, bringing it for production, and then bringing that produced product in, and everything that it takes end to end to make that happen.
Great, thank you. So this question too, I think I'm going to kind of direct this one to Sherry. This is one that came in through our Q&A module, and it has to do with resources, and resources that are kind of in an unknown category or an unknown territory, and how we move into supply chain of a bleeding edge domain. I don't understand all of those terms. I can kind of put it into context, but I thought, Sherry, that you might be able to, because I'm sure you can see that, be able to answer that question, who is actually from Sarah Hasling, one of our alumna from Notre Dame.
Yes.
Yes.
Let me see. I don't see the original question, but I think what she's getting at is, what if you're in a complex supply chain and you don't really know who you're sourcing from in a more remote part of the world, and how do you get closer to ground truth? So this would be a first party signal, or understanding who you're shaking hands with in the digital world and the web of assumptions that is sourcing and procurement. Is that the question? If she can just
I think that is, and I think that Sarah can answer that for us if she's still here, but if not, yeah. I do think you've gotten to the crux of the question.
So there are a lot of, if it's a commodity, and it kind of depends on the category, you can actually get closer to the farmer, get closer to that through technology. There are ways where you can incentivize that connection beyond something called a tier 0 hub, aggregation hub, or tier 1 supplier. So a lot of these folks will feed in, and it's sort of like every node pulls through and moves downstream, as Susan was articulating. You can look at this through a sourcing platform. So I don't want to name any vendors, but you can use things like ISO certifications, or there are other ways that you can certify or ensure that they have the right quality standards and the right ESG level metrics that are baseline, that align to your sourcing protocol and your something called a supplier code of conduct. A lot of these are uploaded in a way that's safe and secure, and there is a sort of desktop authenticity. So you can view those requirements in-app or when you're making your sourcing decision. Let's just say you have no idea what's going on and your supply chain is operating like a total psychopath. which is often the case in big companies. Some companies have hundreds of thousands of suppliers that they might not even interact with the deeper you go in your supply base to the nth tier, NTH tier. You can look at your spend data. And this is part of what I do when companies want to know, where do I start? Look, I have 200 people in my organization. I don't have time to go through 100,000 suppliers. I need you to point me to like that 1 to 2%. The risk, the hot spot based on, it could be carbon emissions, it could be human rights imperatives. You ingest the spend data and you actually start to build that network so you understand where all those node connections are through trading relationships. So you want to make sure that someone who's operating as XYZ Inc. isn't really paired with someone who is corrupt or someone who does have forced labor, child labor in their supply chain somewhere. And maybe that can be revealed through a lot of really cool advanced AI data analytics, ingesting, massive amounts of data and then scraping and crawling. So this could also include web crawlers. So you're looking for keyword searches, chat rooms, using bots and other things that are pretty sophisticated in order to get that pulse of, is this person who they say they are? Again, it's not a guarantee, but it's at least going to give you a really good indicator in this massive pile of suppliers, especially the supplier who you've never met, who's 20,000 miles away. It's that and it gets you started. So then you can audit, you can request very specific information. You typically will either send a questionnaire that's very in-depth. And then again, when you get the answers, we have advanced AI that can scrape and it's a sentiment analysis where you can tell if they're likely telling the truth or not. It's pretty easy to spot as a sourcing and procurement professional. And then you actually have on-site audits. So all of these things will get you hopefully closer to ground truth. Do I actually know what's happening on the ground without physically being there and using technology to help me get smarter and make better decisions? That was a long way of answering it. I hope I answered your question.
No, that was a really stimulating answer, actually.
It was.
I feel like, yeah, a really stimulating answer. I'm finding myself getting very, very excited about supply chain, even more so than I was at the beginning. So I know we are very, very close to the end, but we have one question that I think would be a great way to wind up. And I apologize to everyone that we didn't get to every question that we had here. But I would like to get some wisdom from you both, Sherry and Susan. And this is one of the beauties of this forum, is that we get to hear directly from women like you both who have been in the trenches, are in the trenches, and have had wonderful success. What is a piece of career advice that you would share with your younger self that you wish you had discovered earlier? And it might be more than one. It might be something that's glaring for you or something that's just kind of come to you recently. I don't know, but that's definitely one of the questions we had. And that's another question from one of our alumni, Nikki Gaywood. So Susan or Sherry, who would like to go first?
Would you like for me?
Yeah.
Jump in? Sure. Younger Susan was very intentional about every career move. And I was almost methodical in my decision-making process, and too methodical. Every decision was, is this going to get me where I want to go 2 jobs later? Fast forward to almost 30 years of experience in the second part of my career, I was open-minded standing on that glacier, allowing myself to take it all in and be moved so much that I would take my career in a completely different direction and do something so bold to create this company that would change the way home products were made going forward. I would be more open-minded in my younger self and less methodical and rigid in terms of where I thought I would go.
I love that, Susan. I I was not as methodical. I made a lot of decisions that probably looking back, you know, you shake your head and you're like, what were you thinking? But I would not have let people proofread the vision that I had for myself.
Mm.
There were so many moments, again, I think because I come from very humble beginnings and I didn't really have the network or support. I didn't know anyone in supply chain. No one in my family actually works in supply chain, believe it or not, except me. So I couldn't see it. And being able to see it is so important as a young woman. I didn't have any executive women in my family. Most of the women in my family, they never went to college and they stayed at home. So it was that visualization. And then also I had believed a lot of things that people have told me over the years that limited me. And it's interesting because looking back, all of the things that I thought would actually limit my potential, single mother, poor upbringing, being divorced, I'm remarried now, you know, first generation college student, adult learner, those prepared me for where I am right now because I could see opportunity in everything. And I had the grit and the determination to problem solve and to really push things forward and be a doer and also be very sensitive to others around me. So my advice would be curious. Don't let other people proofread the vision that you have for yourself. And it's not enough to be, you know, better than folks or be so good they can't ignore you. I know people used to tell me, be so good that they can't ignore you. I think you actually have to make sure that you put empathy at the core of a lot of your decisions, because sometimes it's not about you. It's about how you bring others with you and create opportunities for others when you have the opportunity to be a door opener.
So inspirational, Sherry.
Oh, thank you.
Indeed, indeed. So, wow, we have come to the end of our time together. And I can't tell you how inspirational this has been for me, and I'm sure for everyone in our audience. And I want to thank Sherry, and I would love to thank Susan and Carly. It was wonderful to have you in this special capacity this evening. President Yam, thank you for being with us. And thank everyone who helped make this event very special for our 19th annual BUSTA Business Forum. We hope that you will join us again for WLIB events in the future. And with that, we will sign off and say thank you and we'll see you again next time. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you,
Bye.
Dr. Yan.